The letter hit Frank Hadley's desk like a death sentence. He had not opened it yet. He did not need to. The return address alone, Colfax County Land Office, Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, 1884, told him everything the contents would confirm. They were going to take the northern pasture. 40 years of his life, 40 years of drought and dust, and breaking his back under a merciless sun, and some man behind a polished desk 300 miles away had decided that Frank Hadley's land no longer fully belonged to Frank Hadley. But that was not why his hands were shaking. His hands were shaking because Grace Hart was standing in the middle of his kitchen, her dark hair wild from the wind, her gray eyes blazing with something that was equal parts fury and heartbreak, and she was saying words to him that he had never once in 52 years of living expected to hear from any living soul. "You knew," she said. Her voice was low and terrible and absolutely certain. "You knew about my father's agreement with Vance Corbin, and you said nothing. Nothing, Frank. Not one word. You let me walk into that courthouse like a fool, and you knew the whole time what was waiting for me there." Frank Hadley was not a man who flinched. He had faced down rustlers and droughts and the death of his wife, Eleanor, 11 years ago, and he had not flinched at any of it. He had simply gone numb. He had developed a particular talent for numbness, had worn it like a second skin for so long that he had genuinely, honestly believed he was past feeling anything that mattered. And then Grace Hart had walked into Cimarron 6 weeks ago, and every piece of that carefully constructed armor had begun to crack. Now she was looking at him like he was the villain of her story, and the worst part, the part that made his chest tighten in a way he had not felt since Eleanor's funeral, was that she was not entirely wrong. "Grace," he said. "Do not," she interrupted, and her voice broke on the single syllable, and Frank Hadley felt something in his chest break right along with it. "Do not stand there and give me the face of a man with regrets. I need to know the truth. I need to know all of it, right now, tonight." He pulled out the chair across from her and lowered himself into it, and he set his weathered hands flat on the table between them, and he looked at her, really looked at her. The way a man looks at someone when he knows the next words out of his mouth are going to change everything. "All right," Frank Hadley said quietly. "All right. Then sit down, Grace, because it starts a long time before tonight." 6 weeks earlier, the stagecoach from Santa Fe arrived in Cimarron on a Tuesday morning in late April, trailing dust and the smell of horse sweat, and it deposited 3 passengers onto the wooden sidewalk outside the Palace Hotel. 2 of them were men, salesmen by the look of their soft hands and city shoes, and they disappeared into the hotel before the dust had even settled. The third was Grace Hart. Frank Hadley was not a man who paid much attention to arriving stagecoaches. He had lived in Cimarron long enough to have watched hundreds of them come and go, depositing dreamers and drifters and the occasional desperado onto the streets of the town, and he had learned to look through them the way an old tree looks through weather. They were simply a feature of the landscape. None of them had anything to do with him. He was standing outside McCready's Hardware buying a new length of chain for his fence gate when the stagecoach pulled in, and he glanced up out of pure habit, and then he looked away again, and then something pulled his gaze back. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, not the way the women in the illustrated magazines were beautiful, with their soft curves and their carefully arranged expressions. Grace Hart was something else entirely. She was tall for a woman, and she stood with the straight-backed posture of someone who had been told her whole life to hold herself up, and had decided to take that advice further than anyone intended. She was perhaps 28, maybe 30, with a face that had been shaped by some combination of intelligence and difficulty, and she was looking at the town of Cimarron the way you look at a chess board when you're trying to figure out which pieces to trust. She carried a single leather travel bag and a rectangular case that Frank recognized, after a moment, as belonging to a surveying instrument. A theodolite, likely, or a level. He had seen enough surveying equipment in his years to recognize the distinctive shape of the case. That was the first unusual thing about Grace Hart. The second was that she walked directly to the land office instead of the hotel, despite the fact that she had presumably been riding a stagecoach for the better part of a day and a half. Frank watched her go, and then he took his chain and went back to his horse and told himself he had no reason whatsoever to be curious about a woman with a surveying case and purposeful footsteps. He made it exactly 4 days before he spoke to her. It was not, he would tell himself later, that he had been thinking about her. It was purely coincidence that he happened to be at the land office on the same Saturday morning that she was there, arguing in a controlled and precise voice with Harlan Boggs, the land registrar, about the boundary survey on a parcel of land called the Hart claim. He heard her name, and the name of the claim, and he stopped moving. The Hart claim. He knew that piece of land. He knew it the way he knew every piece of land in Colfax County, because land was the thing that had defined his entire adult life, and the Hart claim sat about 11 miles northwest of his own Double H Ranch, along a stretch of creek bottom that had been disputed, settled, redisputed, and resettled so many times that the original survey markers had long since disappeared into the grass. He stood in the doorway of the land office and listened. The original survey was filed in 1871, Grace was saying. She had spread a map across the registrar's counter and was pointing at it with a slender finger. My father, Joseph Hart, homesteaded this parcel under the Homestead Act and fulfilled the 5-year residency requirement. These are his papers. She placed a bundle of documents on the counter beside the map. The claim is legally his, or was legally his. He died in February of this year. The land passes to me as his only surviving heir. Harlan Boggs, a narrow little man with ink-stained fingers and the nervous energy of someone who did not enjoy confrontation, shuffled the documents without looking at them. Miss Hart, I understand your position, but there's a competing claim on that parcel filed by Mr. Vance Corbin in January of this year, and under territorial law. Under territorial law, Grace said, with a patience that had a steel wire running through the center of it, a competing claim cannot supersede an existing homestead patent that was properly filed and properly fulfilled. My father's claim predates Mr. Corbin's by 13 years. I would like you to explain to me, precisely and legally, how that competing claim has any standing whatsoever. Boggs opened his mouth, closed it, and developed a sudden interest in the papers on his desk. Frank Hadley stepped into the land office. He was not sure later why he did it. He had not planned to. He had plenty of his own business to attend to, and getting involved in someone else's land dispute was the sort of thing he had been careful to avoid for decades. Cimarron was a town with a complicated history of land violence. The Lincoln County troubles were barely 5 years in the past, and the wounds from the Santa Fe Ring's land manipulations had not fully healed, and a smart man kept his head down. Frank Hadley stepped into the land office anyway. Harlan, he said, and his voice came out with the particular quiet authority that comes from being a man who has owned land in a county for 25 years and has never once been in serious debt. Is there a problem with the Hart documentation? Boggs looked up with something very close to relief. Mr. Hadley, no problem. Miss Hart and I were just discussing the Corbin filing. Corbin, Frank said. The name had a taste to it he did not like. Grace Hart turned to look at him, and her gray eyes assessed him with a frankness that was almost startling. People in Colfax County generally treated Frank Hadley with a certain amount of deference. He was one of the oldest and most established ranchers in the region, and his reputation for straight dealing was known, and most people did not look at him quite so directly in the first 30 seconds of meeting him. You know something about this, she said. Not a question exactly, more of a careful opening. I know Vance Corbin, Frank said, and I know the Hart claim. Your father ran sheep on that land for years. Good man, Joseph Hart. I was sorry to hear he passed. Something moved through Grace's expression at that. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition, the look of someone who is perpetually braced for indifference, being surprised by the existence of decency. You knew my father. Not well. Well enough to know he was honest, Frank looked at Boggs. The competing claim, is it registered or is it in process? Registered, Boggs said, and he said it the way people say things they wish they did not have to say. Frank looked at the map on the counter. He looked at it for a long moment, reading the terrain the way he had read terrain his whole life, and then he looked at Grace. The survey on that claim is going to be wrong, he said. The creek moved after the flood of 1879. Anybody who surveyed that land after the flood would have a different read on the eastern boundary than your father's original patent. Grace stared at him. Then she turned back to her map. Then she turned back to him with an expression that was, for the first time, something approaching respect. You're saying Corbin's survey used the current creek bed. I'm saying it's possible, and if it did, and if that's what his boundary argument is based on, then it's built on a fiction, because the legal boundary under your father's patent was the old creek bed, and that's documented in the original survey. Boggs made a small sound that might have been a strangled protest. Grace Hart folded her map with quick, precise movements and tucked it under her arm. I'm going to need to go out to that land, she said, today if possible. I'll take you, Frank said. He had no idea why he said that either. They rode out to the Hart claim that afternoon, Frank on his big roan gelding and Grace on a hired mare from the town livery, with her surveying case strapped behind her saddle. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour, which suited Frank perfectly, because he was not a man who talked for the sake of filling air. He had noticed, over the years, that people who filled silence compulsively were usually uncomfortable with their own thoughts, and he had never had that particular problem. He had plenty of thoughts. He simply tended to keep them where they belonged. Grace Hart apparently felt the same way. She rode well with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up on horseback, and she watched the terrain around her with sharp, cataloging attention, noting features the way someone notes them when they are building a mental map. You said you owned the Double H Ranch, she said, eventually, when they had crossed the first ridge and the creek bottom was beginning to appear below them through the cottonwoods. 25 years, Frank said. Cattle, mostly, some horses. She was quiet for a moment. My father ran sheep. I imagine that made him unpopular with the cattlemen around here. Some, Frank admitted, not with me. She glanced at him sideways. Why not? Because I'm not the sort of man who hates something just because it's different from what I do, Frank said. Sheep don't bother cattle as much as cattlemen like to claim, and your father had enough sense to keep his flocks on the creek bottom grass where the cattle didn't graze anyway. Grace nodded slowly, as though he had passed some kind of test. He wrote about this place in his letters, she said. He loved it. He used to say the creek made a sound in the evenings like music. Frank did not say anything. He had heard that creek in the evenings. He knew what Joseph Hart had meant. They reached the land as the sun was beginning to drop toward the western ridges, throwing long gold light across the grassy bottom and painting the cottonwoods in shades of amber and green. Grace dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, pulled her surveying case from behind the saddle, and had the theodolite set up on its tripod before Frank had finished tying his horse to a branch. He watched her work. He could not quite help it. She moved through the landscape with a focused efficiency that was somehow also graceful, setting her instrument, taking readings, making notes in a small book she kept in her coat pocket. She clearly knew what she was doing. A woman who knew how to operate a theodolite in 1884 in the New Mexico territory was not a common thing, and Frank was aware of it in the way you're aware of the strangeness of a thing when the strangeness is also the most interesting thing about it. Where did you learn to survey? He asked after a while. My father taught me, she said, without looking up from her instrument. He couldn't afford to hire a professional surveyor to check his lines, so he taught himself, and then he taught me. I got better at it than he was. A small pause. He was proud of that, oddly enough. A lot of fathers wouldn't have been. He sounds like an unusual man. He was. She straightened from the instrument and looked out at the creek. The evening light was doing exactly what Joseph Hart had described in his letters, laying itself across the water in long gold sheets that made the whole bottom glow. He wanted me to have this land. He wanted me to have something that was mine, not because someone gave it to me, but because I fought for it. Frank looked out at the creek too. "You're going to have to fight for it," he said. "I know." She said it without drama, with the flat certainty of someone who has been fighting for things their whole life and has simply accepted that as the nature of existence. "That's why I'm here." They rode back to Cimarron in the dusk, and the conversation between them was different on the return, looser, more ranging, the kind of talk that happens when two people have shared a landscape and found that they both saw something real in it. Grace asked him about the history of the county, and he told her, without editorializing too much, the outline of the Lincoln County War and the land grant disputes that had cost so many men their claims and occasionally their lives. She listened with the focused attention of someone who was taking notes even when her hands were empty. "Vance Corbin," she said. "What is he?" Frank considered the question. "He's a businessman. Came to Cimarron about 3 years ago from somewhere back east. Nobody entirely knows where. He buys land. Sometimes he buys it fairly. Sometimes he finds the edges of legality and uses them. He's not violent, not directly, but he has lawyers and he has money, and in this territory that's frequently enough." "What does he want with a sheep farmer's creek bottom claim?" "Water rights," Frank said. "The creek that runs through your father's land feeds into the main channel about 2 miles south. Corbin has been buying up land along that channel for 2 years. He wants to control the water. If he controls the water, he controls who can ranch in the entire lower valley." Grace absorbed this with a terrible stillness. "So it's not about my father's land specifically." "No, your father's land just happens to sit on a piece of the puzzle he needs." She was quiet for a long time after that. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality to it, still controlled, but with something underneath it that was rawer. "He doesn't care that my father spent 14 years building that homestead. He doesn't care that my father died believing he was leaving me something. To Corbin, it's just a square on a map." "That's about right," Frank said, and he hated saying it because it was true. They parted outside the Palace Hotel, and Frank rode home in the full dark, and he sat on his porch in the cool night air and tried to remember the last time he had ridden home from somewhere and spent the entire ride thinking about a conversation. He could not remember. He was fairly sure it had been more than 11 years. He told himself it was the land dispute. It was an interesting situation. He had always had a professional interest in land matters. That was all it was. He was a poor liar when it came to himself, but he was stubborn, and it took him another week before he admitted, in the privacy of his own thoughts, that Grace Hart was the most genuinely interesting person he had encountered in many years, and that the feeling of interest was accompanied by other feelings that were significantly more complicated, and that he had absolutely no intention of examining. That week, however, was not without event. On the Wednesday following their ride to the Hart claim, Grace came to find him at the ranch. He saw her coming from the south pasture where he was fixing fence, a small figure on a moving horse against the wide blue of the spring sky, and something in his chest did a thing that he chose to classify as mild surprise. She dismounted at the fence line and held out a sheaf of papers. "I've found something." He took the papers. They were county survey records, old ones, dating back to the early 1870s, and she had annotated them in a precise hand with a series of measurements and compass bearings. "The original survey for my father's claim used a specific rock formation as its eastern reference point," she said. "A distinctive outcrop on the ridge above the creek, about 40 feet high. It's still there. I found it yesterday." Frank looked at the annotations. "And Corbin's survey uses the creek as the eastern boundary." Her gray eyes were bright with something that was close to anger but was channeled into precision. "His surveyor measured from the current creek bed, which, as you told me, shifted west after the 1879 flood. If I can demonstrate that the original eastern boundary marker still exists and that it places the boundary east of the current creek, then Corbin's claim is built on a foundation that doesn't hold." Frank looked at the papers, and then he looked at her and he was quiet for a moment. You did all this in a week. I had motivation, she said simply. You'll need an independent surveyor to file a legal challenge, someone the court will accept. I know. I also know that independent surveyors aren't cheap and I don't have a great deal of money. She said this with a directness that clearly cost her something because she was not a woman who enjoyed admitting limitations. I've written to the General Land Office in Santa Fe. They have a process for disputed claims, but it will take months. Corbin will know you've filed, Frank said. He'll try to move the process in his favor before the federal review comes through. Then, I need to move faster than he does. Frank looked out across his pasture for a moment, thinking. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass, indifferent to everything that was happening between two human beings and a piece of land. I know a surveyor in Springer, he said finally. Good man, fair. He's testified in court before and his work holds up. Grace looked at him with the careful expression of someone who is not sure how much to trust an offer. Why are you helping me? It was a fair question, and Frank appreciated that she asked it instead of simply accepting. He thought about it for a moment, more seriously than the situation may be required. Your father was an honest man who did things the right way, he said. I don't like watching the right way lose to the wrong way. It's not complicated. She studied him for a long moment and then she nodded. Something shifted in her expression, a careful lowering of some defense that she usually kept firmly in place. Thank you, Mr. Hadley. Frank, he said, a small pause. Thank you, Frank. He wrote to Thomas Reeves in Springer that evening, and Reeves arrived in Cimarron 10 days later, and Frank took him and Grace out to the Hart claim together, and Reeves spent 2 days walking the land and taking careful measurements. And at the end of it, he sat down at Frank's kitchen table and spread his findings across the surface and said, with the quiet authority of a man who has surveyed land in 3 territories and 2 states, that the original eastern boundary marker was exactly where Grace's research said it was, and that Corbin's survey had used an incorrect baseline. It's not a subtle error, Reeves said. It moves the eastern boundary of the Hart claim approximately 340 feet east of where Corbin's filing places it. The discrepancy is significant enough that the original homestead pat clearly encompasses the water rights Corbin is claiming. Grace was very still. Frank watched her out of the corner of his eye and saw the exact moment the tension she had been carrying for weeks shifted into something that was not yet relief, but was moving toward it. This is enough to challenge the competing filing, she asked. More than enough, Reeves said, assuming the land office in Santa Fe is operating honestly. There was a silence around the table that held a specific weight, because everyone in that room knew that operating honestly was not always a given in territorial land matters. The Santa Fe ring, the loose network of lawyers, politicians, and businessmen who had manipulated land and law in New Mexico territory for years, had been officially disrupted, but its influence was not entirely gone, and Vance Corbin had connections that ran in uncomfortable directions. Frank refilled the coffee cups and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. 3 days after Reeves left, Frank was in town picking up supplies when he saw Corbin for the first time since Grace's arrival. Vance Corbin was about 45, a trim, well-dressed man with the easy manner of someone who had never once in his life been uncertain about his own importance. He was coming out of the bank when Frank passed on the street, and he stopped, and his eyes went to Frank with a calculating assessment that Frank had seen in enough faces over the years to know exactly what it meant. Hadley, Corbin said pleasantly. Corbin, Frank said, with the same pleasant neutrality that meant absolutely nothing on either side. I hear you've been making friends with the Hart woman. Corbin smiled. It was the kind of smile that a man wears when he wants you to know he has information. Interesting. I wouldn't have thought a sheep farmer's daughter would be your type of company. I wasn't aware I had a type of company, Frank said. Corbin looked up the street casually as if the conversation were already boring him. She's going to file a challenge, I assume. It won't go well for her. You sound certain. I am certain. Corbin looked back at Frank, and the pleasant mask thinned slightly at the edges. The territorial processes have a way of favoring people who understand them. She's a woman alone with a dead man's papers and no political connection. That's not a strong hand. Frank looked at him steadily. "Good afternoon, Corbin," he said, and continued down the street. He told Grace about the encounter that evening. He had taken to stopping by the Palace Hotel in the early evenings, initially under the pretense of updates on the land matter, and then with a decreasing amount of pretense. Grace had taken to sitting on the hotel's small front porch in the late afternoon, reviewing her notes and documents, and Frank would come and they would talk, and the talks had begun to range well beyond the specifics of the Hart claim. She listened to his account of the conversation with Corbin with her arms folded and her gray eyes narrow. "He's warning you off," she said. "He's trying to." And Frank looked at her. "I don't respond well to warnings from men like Corbin." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the same directness she brought to everything, "I don't want to put you in a difficult position, Frank. You have your own land, your own relationships in this county. If helping me costs you something, Grace," he said, and his voice came out a little rougher than he intended, "I'm 52 years old and I've been ranching in Colfax County for 25 years, and I've outlasted the Lincoln County War and 2 droughts and a market crash. Vance Corbin is not a difficult position." She looked at him for a long moment, and then a very small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, the first one he had seen, and it did something entirely inconvenient to his chest. "All right," she said, "but I want you to know that I'm aware of what it costs." He walked home that night through the warm spring darkness, and he stood on his porch and looked out at the land that was his and thought about what she had said, the quiet precision of her awareness, and he thought that he had genuinely believed he was past feeling things like this. He had been wrong. He was going to have to do something about that belief, clearly. What he did, initially, was nothing. He continued helping her with the land challenge in a practical capacity. He introduced her to Tom Garrett, the county's most respected attorney, who agreed to take her case on a deferred payment basis after reviewing Reeves's survey. He vouched for her character and her father's with several people in the county who had influence with the territorial bureaucracy. He continued his evening conversations on the hotel porch, and he began to look forward to them in a way that he recognized and was slightly alarmed by and did nothing about. The weeks passed. May turned warm and golden, the kind of spring that makes you believe the world is fundamentally generous, and the land around Cimarron was green and alive, and achingly beautiful in the way that high desert country is beautiful after winter, with a vividness that seems to justify every hard month that came before it. Grace began to know the ranch. It started practically. Frank brought her out to show her a section of creek that ran parallel to the Hart claim on the Double H's eastern boundary, because understanding the water flow was relevant to her legal case. And while they were there, she asked questions about the cattle operation and the grazing patterns and the way he managed the land, and the conversation opened up into something broader. He found himself showing her things he had not shown anyone in years: the spring where the creek had its source, the ridge where you could see 3 counties on a clear day, the old homestead site of the first settler in this part of the valley, marked now by nothing but a square depression in the earth and a few rose bushes gone wild. She was interested in everything. Not with the performance of interest, but with the genuine article, the kind of attention that means a person actually wants to understand what they're looking at. He found himself talking about Eleanor once, briefly. He mentioned her in passing in the context of the old vegetable garden behind the ranch house, which he still maintained with more care than was strictly necessary for a man who ate mostly beef and biscuits. Grace asked a question, just one, without pressure, and he answered it, and then they moved on, and he was aware that she had handled the moment with a kind of tact that was entirely instinctive rather than calculated. Later that evening, He sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and thought about the fact that he had spoken Aliner's name aloud for the first time in several years, and that it had not felt like tearing something open, the way it usually did. It had felt oddly like setting something down. The land challenge moved forward. Tom Garrett filed the formal documentation with the Territorial Land Office in late May, supported by Reeves's survey and a stack of affidavits from neighbors who had known Joseph Hart and could testify to his long-term occupation of the claim. The federal process was slow, the way official processes are slow, but it was moving. Corbin, as Frank had expected, was not idle. The first thing Corbin did was quietly pressure Harlan Boggs at the land office to delay processing the affidavits. Boggs, to his credit, and perhaps because Frank had a quiet word with him about the nature of obstruction in territorial land cases, did not comply. The affidavits were processed on schedule. The second thing Corbin did was more direct. He had a man approach Tom Garrett with an offer, not a bribe exactly, but a suggestion that Corbin's interests were substantial and his reach was long, and that attorneys who made enemies of him in this county had a way of finding their practices affected. Garrett was a man who had been practicing law in Colfax County since 1878, and he had weathered the Santa Fe ring at its height, and he told Corbin's man to convey his respectful refusal. The third thing Corbin did was the one that brought the whole situation to a head. He went to Frank. It was a Friday evening in early June, and Frank was in his barn doing the last check before dark when Corbin rode into his yard with two men behind him. They were not armed men, exactly, but they were large in the way that men are large when they are employed specifically for their size, and they arranged themselves with a casual obviousness that was its own kind of message. Corbin dismounted and walked to the barn entrance with the ease of a man who believes the world will make room for him. "I'll come to the point," he said, because he was at least efficient. "I know you've been helping the Hart woman. I know you paid for Reeves to come from Springer. I know you talked to Garrett." Frank set down the bucket he was carrying and looked at Corbin without expression. "All right. I want to know why a man of your position is involving himself in a dispute that has nothing to do with him." "It has to do with what's right," Frank said. Corbin's face did something complicated. "That's a very romantic position for a man your age." "I'm past the age of being embarrassed by it," Frank said. Corbin looked at him for a moment, and then his expression shifted into something that was more direct, stripping away the pleasantness. "The Hart claim sits on water that I need. I have plans for this valley that will bring money and development and jobs to Cimarron, and that creek is a critical piece of those plans. I'm willing to pay a fair price for the land, more than fair, enough that the Hart woman could go anywhere and start over comfortably." "You should make that offer to her," Frank said. "I'm making it to you because I think you have more influence over her than you perhaps realize," Corbin said. "And because I think you're a practical man who understands that fighting the inevitable is expensive and exhausting." Frank picked up his bucket again. "Good night, Mr. Corbin." Corbin stood in the barn entrance for a moment longer. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, quieter, with a flatness to it that was more genuinely threatening than anything he had said before. "Hadley, I've been looking into the survey records for your northern pasture." Frank went still. "There's an old boundary question there," Corbin said. "Nothing conclusive, but the kind of thing that a man with resources could make very inconvenient." He paused. "I'd hate for this situation to become complicated for both of you." He left. His men followed him. Their horses' hoofbeats faded into the evening. Frank stood in his barn for a long time after that, looking at nothing in particular, while the implications of what Corbin had just said arranged themselves into their true shape. The Northern Pasture Survey question was not new. Frank had known about it for years, a discrepancy in the original grant documentation that had never been legally challenged because it was obscure and complicated, and everyone who knew about it had decided, collectively, to leave it alone. It was not a strong claim against him, but it was the kind of thing that, in the hands of a motivated attorney with money behind him, could be turned into years of litigation and doubt, and the kind of uncertainty that made banks nervous when it came time to renew operational credit. Corbin was telling him that if Frank continued to help Grace, his own land could become the battleground. He sat down on a hay bale in his barn, and he looked at the dirt floor, and he thought about Alina, who had died on this land and was buried under the cottonwood at the south end of the yard. He thought about the 25 years of his life that were in this ground. He thought about what it meant to lose something you had built your whole existence around. And then, for reasons that he was only beginning to understand, he thought about Grace Hart, standing at the edge of the creek bottom in the long evening light, looking at the land her father had loved and telling him that she was going to fight for it. He went into his house, and he sat at his desk, and he opened the letter from the Colfax County Land Office that had arrived that morning. The one he had not yet opened, the one with the return address that told him everything before he read a word, and he read it. The letter informed him that a boundary question had been registered with the county office regarding the northern pasture of the Double H Ranch, and that a preliminary review would be scheduled within 90 days. Corbin had already moved. He had moved before the conversation in the barn, Frank realized. He had moved before he ever came to Frank with his offer. The registration had been filed days ago, which meant the offer had never been a negotiation. It had been a demonstration. Corbin was showing Frank what he was prepared to do, and the offer to stop was contingent on Frank stepping away from Grace. He sat at his desk for a long time, with the letter in front of him, and he thought very carefully about what he was going to do. And then he thought about the fact that Corbin had known about the survey question on the northern pasture. That information was not public. It was not something anyone could find in the county records without specific knowledge of what they were looking for, because the original discrepancy was buried in documentation that required a detailed reading of the 1868 land grant to find. Frank knew about it because he had done that reading himself, years ago, when he was first establishing the ranch's legal footing. He had never told anyone else, almost no one else. There had been one conversation, a long time ago. A conversation with a man who had subsequently done some work for the Double H in a legal capacity, and who had since moved in circles that Frank now connected, with a cold and sinking recognition, to Vance Corbin's network. It was not a betrayal exactly, because it had not been given in confidence. But it was a hidden connection, a piece of information about Frank's land that had traveled from an old conversation to Corbin's desk, and Frank knew that if he had known about that connection earlier, he would have warned Grace. He had not warned her. He had not warned her because he had not made the connection until tonight, sitting with Corbin's letter in his hand, and the full picture suddenly visible in a way it had not been before. He had not been concealing it from her deliberately. But the result, from Grace's perspective, would look the same either way. Because 2 days ago, Grace had told him in the confidence of their evening conversation that she had a meeting with the county courthouse on Monday about the boundary filing. She had told him which papers she was bringing. She had told him her strategy. And if Corbin's people were watching, if there were eyes on Grace's movements that Frank had not accounted for, then Monday's courthouse meeting could walk directly into a trap. He needed to tell her. He went to the hotel that night in the dark, and she was still awake. She was always still awake. She had the insomniac's relationship with the small hours, and he sat across from her at the small table in the hotel's front room and explained everything. The letter, the barn conversation, the connection he had just made. She listened to all of it without speaking, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "There's something else." "What?" "The attorney I spoke to 2 weeks ago, before I hired Garrett. He was recommended to me by someone in Santa Fe. I thought he was independent, but when I got here I realized he had a connection to Corbin's interests. I didn't know that when he and I spoke. But I told him about the boundary question on your northern pasture, Frank. I'd found the same thing in the county records while I was researching my own case, and I mentioned it to him as an example of survey discrepancy. She looked at him steadily. "I didn't know he was connected to Corbin. I didn't know it mattered. I found out about the connection after and I was going to tell you, but then I thought." "You thought it might have been me," Frank said quietly. She didn't deny it. "I didn't know what to think. I'm sorry." The silence between them had a particular texture. "I was going to tell you," she said again, and her voice had something in it that was both firm and fragile, the voice of someone who is being completely honest about something that frightens them. "I just needed to understand it first. I needed to be sure what it meant before I said anything." Frank looked at her across the table, and he understood it completely, because it was exactly the kind of thing he would have done himself. Needed to understand before speaking. Needed to be certain before committing. "We're dealing with the same problem," he said. "Yes. Corbin has been gathering information on both of us and using what each of us knows to build leverage against the other." "And against us together," Grace said. Frank looked at her when she said that. Together. It was a word that had specific weight when Grace Hart said it, because Grace Hart did not say things carelessly, and he did not think she had said that carelessly. "He came to warn you off me," Grace said, and her gray eyes were steady and direct. "He thinks if he threatens your land, you'll step back, and then I'm alone." "He's wrong," Frank said. "He has your northern pasture in play. He has a question about my northern pasture that will take years and money to resolve, and I have 25 years of established operation and clean credit, and a reputation in this county that Corbin hasn't had time to build." Frank leaned forward slightly. "He's threatening me with a long, inconvenient fight. I've had long, inconvenient fights before. I'm still here." Grace was quiet, and in her quietness there was something that was not quite emotion and not quite calculation, but was some particular combination of the two that was entirely characteristic of her. "Frank," she said carefully, "what you're risking." "I know what I'm risking," he said. He said it with more feeling than he had intended, and he heard it in his own voice, and he did not walk it back. "I know exactly what I'm risking, and I'm risking it because it's the right thing and because," he stopped. He looked at the table, then he looked back at her. "Because I want to, that's all." She looked at him for a long, serious moment. "How long has it been since you wanted to do something?" she asked. And it was not an unkind question. It was the most perceptive thing anyone had said to him in years. He thought about it honestly. "A while," he said. She nodded very slightly, as if that answer confirmed something she had been thinking about but had not been sure of. "I'll tell you something," she said. "I've been running since my father got sick. Running and planning and thinking 3 moves ahead and never letting myself feel anything for more than about 30 seconds at a time, because if I stopped running long enough to feel things, I wouldn't be able to run anymore." She folded her hands on the table. "This land is the first thing in a very long time that has made me want to stop running." The silence between them was a different kind of silence now. Frank was aware of it the way you're aware of a shift in weather. "And you're the second," she said, very quietly. Frank Hadley sat very still. He was a man who had spent 11 years being certain that the part of him that was capable of this kind of feeling had gone to the ground with a leaner, under the cottonwood at the south end of the yard. He had been so certain of it that he had built an entire life around the certainty. He had been comfortable in that certainty, in the way that losses become comfortable when you've lived with them long enough that they feel like furniture. And then Grace Hart had come along, and here he was at a table in the Palace Hotel at 11 o'clock at night, completely certain of the opposite thing. He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with his, and she did not move away, and that was enough for now. That was more than enough. "All right," he said. "Monday morning we go to the courthouse together. We don't walk into anything alone." "Together," Grace said, and this time she said it with a different quality, a finality that was also a beginning. Monday came with a sharp, clear sky and a wind out of the northwest that smelled like approaching summer. Frank met Grace at the hotel at 8 o'clock, and they walked to the courthouse side by side with Tom Garrett, who had reviewed the full situation over the weekend, and had arrived Monday morning with the contained energy of a man who has found a legal argument he genuinely believes in. Corbin was there. He was standing in the courthouse corridor with his own attorney, a man named Marcus Webb who had come up from Santa Fe and whose reputation was not entirely clean, but whose technical skill was documented. Corbin looked at Frank and Grace together, and something moved behind his eyes that was the first genuinely unguarded expression Frank had seen from him. He had not expected them together. Garrett presented the full documentation to the county judge, a solid, deliberate man named Augustus Mercer who had been on the bench in Colfax County for 8 years and who did not have a political allegiance to either side of the room. The presentation took 2 hours. Reeves's survey findings, Grace's research on the original eastern boundary marker, the affidavits from Joseph Hart's neighbors, the complete timeline of the homestead patent. Webb objected at several points, skillfully, and Garrett met each objection with the documentation that addressed it, which he had arranged in order specifically, because he had anticipated the objections. Judge Mercer listened to all of it with his hands folded on his desk and his face professionally expressionless. When the presentations were complete, he looked at both sides of the room for a long moment. "I'm going to order an independent review by the General Land Office in Santa Fe," he said. "In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary injunction against any transfer, sale, or modification of the Hart claim pending that review. Mr. Corbin's competing filing is suspended." Webb started to speak. Mercer looked at him and Webb sat down. "The independent review will be completed within 60 days, Mercer said. "We will reconvene when those findings are delivered." They walked out of the courthouse into the clear June morning, and Garrett shook both their hands and said he thought it had gone as well as it could have. And then he left, and Frank and Grace stood on the courthouse steps in the bright sun. Grace looked up at the sky for a moment, and then she closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them the expression on her face was one of the most honest things Frank had ever seen on a human face. The look of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer will for so long that the first moment of breathing room is physically visible. 60 days, she said. 60 days, he agreed. She looked at him. "What happens to your northern pasture question while we wait?" "Nothing," Frank said. "Corbin knows that proceeding against me while his own filing is under federal review would be a poor strategic choice. He'll wait and see how the Hart case goes. If he wins the federal review, he won't need to pursue me. If he loses, he'll have bigger problems than my northern pasture." Grace was quiet for a moment. "And if he loses the review, he loses the water rights he needs for his valley plan." "Yes." "Good," she said, with a quiet, clean conviction that was completely without cruelty. "That's the right result." They had breakfast at the hotel dining room, and the conversation moved through the practical and into the personal with the ease that had become characteristic of their time together, and Frank watched Grace eat a plate of eggs with the appetite of someone who had been too tense to eat well for weeks and found that he was smiling, which was another thing that had been relatively rare in the last 11 years. She noticed because she noticed everything. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "It's good to see you eat." She looked at him with those direct gray eyes and said, "You've been feeding me, you know, not literally." But she paused, considering how to say it. "You've been handing me things I needed when I needed them. The surveyor, the attorney, the knowledge of the land. You gave me the thing about the creek bed before you had any reason to." "You would have figured it out," Frank said. "Eventually. But you handed it to me immediately and you didn't make me feel like I owed you something for it. You just gave it." She looked at her coffee. "That's not a small thing." Frank looked at his own coffee. Outside the dining room window, the main street of Cimarron was going through its morning routines, horses and wagons and the distant sound of the blacksmith, the ordinary texture of a small western town in early summer. He had looked at that same street for 25 years, and it had always seemed like background to him, like the walls of the place where his life happened. It seemed slightly more vivid this morning. "My wife was like that," he said, and surprised himself by saying it. "A leaner. She had a quality of giving things without making you feel the weight of the gift. I've spent 11 years trying to understand how she did it, and I've never entirely worked it out." Grace was quiet, listening. "She would have liked you," Frank said. It came out with a certainty that surprised him, and then didn't surprise him at all because it was simply true. "Tell me about her," Grace said, and it was the most gently, carefully offered invitation he had ever received. He told her. Not everything, not all at once, but enough: Eleanor's humor, her stubbornness about the vegetable garden, the way she had always known what the weather was going to do before any sign appeared in the sky, the long winter evenings, and the particular quality of her voice when she laughed. He talked about the pneumonia that had taken her in January of 1873, and the way the ranch had felt afterward, like a house with all the furniture removed, the space there, but the meaning gone from it. Grace listened to all of it, and when he finished she said, "You've kept her garden." "I have. That means something. It means I don't know how to let some things go," he said. She looked at him. "Or it means some things are worth holding on to." The 60 days passed in a way that was different from other time. Not slowly, not quickly, but fully charged with the texture of something that mattered, something being built rather than simply endured. Grace stayed in Cimarron. She had nowhere to go while the federal review was pending, and she spent the weeks deepening her knowledge of the land and the community, going out to the Hart claim regularly to document its condition and maintain a visible presence that established her continued connection to it. Frank took her riding into the wider country around Cimarron, up into the mountains to the west, where the ponderosa pines made the air smell like something clean and ancient, out across the eastern flats, where the grass ran in long waves like green water under the summer wind. They rode together in the way that people ride together when they have found the particular rhythm of each other's company, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, both comfortable with both. He taught her things about cattle that she absorbed with her characteristic focused attention, and sometimes challenged with questions that made him think harder about things he had been doing by habit for decades. She taught him things about sheep that he found himself genuinely interested in, which was not a position he had expected to occupy. She had dinner at the ranch 3 times that July, and each time she stayed longer and left a little less formally, and the last time she stayed so late that he insisted on riding back to town with her in the moonlight rather than letting her ride alone in the dark. And when they reached the hotel and she dismounted, she stood at her horse's side for a moment before going in and looked at him in the pale light with an expression that was clear and certain and complicated all at once. "Frank," she said. "Grace," he said. "I'm not past this," she said, and it was such a specific and direct way of saying what she was saying that he felt it somewhere in the region of his chest that he had been trying to close off for more than a decade. "I wanted you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Neither am I," he said. "I wasn't sure until recently, but I'm not past this either." She smiled at him fully for the first time. Not the small, careful smile he had seen before, but the whole thing, illuminating her face in a way that changed it completely. And then she said good night and went inside. He rode home in the dark under a sky full of stars, and the land around him was silver and quiet and vast, and he felt it in the way he had felt it when he was young, when everything was still possible, and the world had not yet taught him to expect loss, that particular physical sensation of being alive and aware of it, of the air and the movement, and the enormous ordinary beauty of existing on this particular piece of earth. He had thought he was past feeling that too. The Federal Review came back in the first week of August. Tom Garrett delivered the news in person, coming to the ranch on a Wednesday morning with a document wallet under his arm, and the expression of a man who is trying to maintain professional composure around what is clearly a very satisfying result. The General Land Office's independent surveyor had confirmed Reeves's findings. The original eastern boundary marker of the Hart claim was correctly identified. The boundary of the claim extended 340 feet east of the line described in Corbin's competing filing. The homestead patent was valid and complete. Corbin's filing was disallowed. Grace sat at Frank's kitchen table and read the document 3 times. The third time she set it down carefully and she pressed her fingertips flat against the table's surface and she breathed. "It's mine," she said. "My father's land, it's actually mine." "It's yours," Frank said. She looked up at him and her gray eyes were bright with something that was entirely private and entirely real. 14 years he worked that land, she said. He died thinking he might lose it. He never knew. He knew what he built, Frank said. He knew he was leaving you something worth fighting for. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she stood up, and she walked to where Frank was standing by the kitchen window, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked up at him with a directness that was the most personal thing he had ever received from anyone, and she said, "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as a statement of fact, not as a question." "All right," he said. "I came to Cimarron to fight for my father's land," she said. "I didn't come for anything else. I wasn't looking for anything else. And somewhere in the middle of fighting for that land, I found something that I didn't know I was missing and that I don't want to imagine not having." She paused. "That something is you." Frank Hadley stood in his kitchen in the August morning light and felt every carefully maintained wall he had built over 11 years of solitude come down simultaneously, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of something that has simply run its course. "Grace," he said, and he put his hands on either side of her face, gently, in the way of someone who knows how to treat valuable things, and she leaned into it with a naturalness that made the gesture feel inevitable. He kissed her, she kissed him back. Outside the kitchen window, the summer was enormous and golden and permanent feeling in the way that August sometimes is, when the heat has settled into the land, and the whole world seems to have arrived at a place it intended to be. What came after was not without its complications, because the real world does not simplify itself simply because two people have found each other and said so. Corbin was not done. He did not contest the Federal Review result. He was a practical man, and he knew when a legal fight was lost, but he was also not gracious about it, and he spent several weeks making life in Cimarron mildly uncomfortable for both of them in the social ways available to a man with money who has been publicly defeated. People who depended on his business relationships were cool. The bank teller was slower than necessary. Small inconveniences accumulated. Frank navigated all of this with the equanimity of a man who has lived in a community for 25 years and knows exactly which relationships are real and which are social weather. He introduced Grace formally to the people who mattered: the Garrett family, the Reeves and Springer, the pastor and his wife, the cluster of established ranching families who formed the actual backbone of the county's social world, and Grace, whose intelligence and directness were on their own terms impressive, made herself known with the same careful competence she brought to everything. She moved out to the Hart claim in September. Frank helped her do it. It was not much of a move. Her belongings from the hotel, a few pieces of furniture she acquired from the general store, the surveying equipment that she was as attached to as he was to his good saddle. The house on the Hart claim was in serviceable condition. Joseph Hart had been a careful builder, and though the structure needed work, it was fundamentally sound. Frank spent 3 weekends fixing the worst of it: new boards on the porch floor, the roof over the bedroom sealed against the coming winter, the chimney cleaned and working properly. He did this with the efficiency of a man who knows how to work with his hands, and Grace worked alongside him with an equal efficiency, and they discovered that they had, in addition to everything else, a satisfying practical compatibility, the kind where two people can share a workspace without collision. She kept her father's sheep. There were 12 of them, elderly and gentle, in the care of a neighbor family through the summer. She brought them back to the Hart claim in October, and they grazed the creek-bottom grass with the serene indifference of creatures who have no idea how much their continued presence on this particular piece of land has cost. Frank watched them from his horse one afternoon and felt a mild affection for them that he would never have predicted 6 months ago. They had not yet spoken in direct terms about what was happening between them. They had kissed on that August morning in the kitchen, and the kiss had been a declaration that was as clear as anything spoken. But they were both people who moved with deliberate intention, and neither of them was inclined to rush toward definition. The feelings were there, fully present, acknowledged between them in every evening conversation and every shared meal and every moment of casual physical proximity that had become, gradually, simply part of how they existed near each other. But October brought cold mornings and the smell of wood smoke and the particular intimacy of winter preparing itself. And Frank rode over to the Hart claim on a Saturday afternoon and found Grace chopping wood in the yard with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. And he stood at the fence and watched her for a moment. She looked up and saw him and put down the axe and walked to the fence, and she looked at him with those straight gray eyes and she said, "Are you planning to do that thing where you look at me from a distance for a while before you say what you actually came to say?" "Probably," he said. She leaned her arms on the fence rail. "Then say it." He looked at her for a moment. The fall light was doing something remarkable to the landscape behind her, the cottonwoods along the creek in full gold, the sky that particular deep blue that you only get in high country in October. He thought about the last 11 years and about Alina and about the northern pasture and Corbin and the long chain of events that had brought him to this fence on this afternoon. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you want that." Grace looked at him for what felt like a very long moment. The creek was making its sound behind her, the sound Joseph Hart had described in his letters, the one that in the evenings was like music. "I want that," she said. It was not a complicated engagement. They were both practical people, and the practical matters were sorted with relative speed. He had the ranch, she had the claim, and after some discussion they agreed that both would be maintained, the Hart claim for the sheep and the garden she was already developing along her father's lines, and the double H for the cattle that were Frank's life's work. They were not so far apart that this presented difficulties. They were married in November in the small Cimarron church, by Pastor William Coleman, with Tom Garrett and his wife in attendance, and a gathering of ranching families who constituted, Frank thought, a genuine community sending its welcome to a woman who had arrived a stranger and made herself real to this place in the course of 6 months. Grace wore a dress the color of blue spruce, which she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Santa Fe, because she was not a woman who would wear someone else's idea of what she ought to look like on her wedding day. Frank wore his best suit, which dated from 1879 and still fit, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Grace walk up the aisle toward him and felt a thing that was so large and so simple that he could not have put it in words without diminishing it. She reached him and looked up at him and said, quietly before the ceremony began, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said, and he meant it completely. The winter that followed was the best winter of Frank Hadley's life, and he had known some good winters, but none of them had this particular quality of completeness, of a house that felt inhabited in the way a house is inhabited when two people bring themselves fully to it. They lived primarily at the Double H through the winter months, it being better winterized and closer to the town for supplies, and Grace put her mark on it the way a woman puts her mark on a space without rearranging it, the small practical changes that reflect a particular way of being present. The vegetable garden would be expanded in spring, she had told Frank, because she intended to actually use it rather than maintain it as a memorial, and he had agreed to this with a feeling that was something like gratitude. She read in the evenings by the fire, serious books, history and science, and a particular interest in land management and water rights that was both practical and intellectual. He read alongside her, which was not something he had done with another person since Alina, and the silence of two people reading in the same room was one of the most quietly profound pleasures he had encountered in years. They talked about everything, about the land, about the county, about what they each believed and how they had come to believe it, about the injustices of the territorial land system, which had broken honest settlers and enriched connected speculators, and was something both of them felt the wrong of without needing to perform the feeling. About her father and about Alina, about what they wanted. In February, Grace told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the particular directness that was simply her way of delivering any significant information. And Frank sat down in his chair and looked at her for a moment with an expression that he was entirely unable to control. "I know it's," Grace started, and he said, "It's wonderful," with a conviction that stopped her. And she looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and something in her face softened in a way that she usually did not let happen. And he stood up and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder. And they stood in the kitchen for a long while in the cold February morning, with the wood stove ticking, and the sound of the wind outside, and the enormous ordinary fact of the future rearranging itself around them. The baby was born in October of 1885, a boy, delivered by the county physician, with Grace proceeding through the whole experience with a focused determination that Frank observed from the other side of the bedroom door and found entirely characteristic of her. He heard the baby's first cry from the hallway, and he sat down on the floor against the wall, which was undignified, and he did not care at all. They named him Joseph, for Grace's father. Joseph Hart Hadley came into the world with dark hair and Frank's stubborn jaw, and within the first few days of his life, he established a personality that was its own thing, entirely curious, loud about his preferences, and completely certain of his right to the attention of everyone in the room. Frank Hadley, who had spent 11 years telling himself he was past feeling, looked at his son sleeping in Grace's arms on the 4th night of his life, and he understood, with the clarity of something simply true, that he had been wrong about that. Not wrong in a painful way. Not wrong in the way of a man who has wasted years, because the years had not been wasted, they had been lived, and the losses in them had been real, and the work had been real, and all of it had been necessary. But wrong in the sense that the capacity for feeling he had thought was gone had simply been waiting, the way land that looks depleted in a dry year will come up green and alive the moment the water returns. Grace had been the water. The Hart claim remained Grace's. She ran her sheep on it through the good seasons and brought them down to the lower pasture in the hard winters. And the land prospered under her management in the way that land prospers when someone who understands it is making the decisions. The creek made its evening sound across the creek bottom grass, the sound that Joseph Hart had described in his letters, and Grace sometimes stood at the edge of the water in the evening light and listened to it with an expression that was private and content. Vance Corbin left Cimarron in the spring of 1886. His valley development plan, stripped of the Hart claim's water rights, had been impossible to complete without the additional capital he had expected to generate by controlling the entire creek system, and his investors had withdrawn their commitment. He went back to wherever he had come from, and Cimarron was not sorry to see him go. The boundary question on Frank's northern pasture was resolved in 1886 as well, through the simple process of hiring Reeves to come out again and do a complete survey of the Double H's full extent, which produced a documented record that was entered into the county land records and put the question entirely to rest. The legal cost was manageable, and the peace of mind was complete. Joseph Hart Hadley grew into a boy who combined his mother's precision with his father's stubbornness in a ratio that produced a child who was simultaneously the pride and the trial of his parents. He was reading by 4, helping with the lambs by 5, and arguing about the most efficient fence line arrangement for the Double H's southwest pasture by 7, with references to specific soil conditions that he had apparently absorbed by osmosis from his mother's dinner table conversations. The second child arrived in 1888. A girl this time born in spring, and they named her Alina, which was Frank's suggestion and which Grace accepted with the specific kind of grace, her own name. No accident, that was her particular gift. Eleanor Hadley had her father's steady temperament and her mother's gray eyes, and from an early age she had a quality of attention, a capacity for watching and understanding before speaking, that Frank recognized and was moved by in ways he found difficult to describe. The ranch and the claim together formed a life that was, Frank thought, on many of the evenings when he sat on the porch in the cooling air, about as good as life could reasonably be expected to be. Not perfect. There were dry summers and sick cattle, and the ordinary difficulties of existence in country that was still demanding and sometimes brutal, but fully, genuinely good. The kind of good that comes from people who know what they have and choose it every day. He and Grace had their arguments, because they were both people with strong opinions and the confidence to hold them, and because a marriage between two such people will always involve the regular negotiation of strongly held positions. They argued about management decisions and county politics, and the right way to put up preserves, and whether Thomas Reeves's youngest daughter was being adequately courted by the banker's son. And the arguments were almost always resolved because they were both people who could be moved by a better argument, and each had married someone capable of making one. In 1889, New Mexico Territory moved another step toward statehood. It would not come until 1912, but the legal framework was developing, and there were new land regulations that required updated registration of all existing claims. Frank and Grace went through the process together, with Garrett's assistance, and emerged from it with documentation that was cleaner and more complete than anything that had existed before, their land clearly and permanently on record. Standing outside the courthouse after the registration was complete, Grace put her arm through Frank's as they walked down the steps, and she said, "My father would have spent 6 months figuring out how to navigate that alone and gotten half of it wrong." "Your father got the important thing right," Frank said. "He got the land." "He did." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about him a lot out on the claim. I think about him planting the claim stakes and building the house and running those first sheep across the creek bottom grass. He had no idea what would happen to it. He just did the work and had faith that doing the work was enough." "It was enough," Frank said. "It was enough," Grace agreed. "With help." He looked at her, walking beside him in the October sun of 1889, her dark hair touched now with the first threads of gray that she wore with the same lack of concern she brought to everything about her appearance. And he thought about the letter and the stagecoach, and the map on the counter in the land office, and the long gold evening light on the creek bottom, and the look on her face in August when she had said, "I'm not past this." He thought about 52 years old and the certainty of numbness. He thought about being wrong and about how infrequently wrong was a gift. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes. "For what?" "For getting off the stagecoach and going straight to the land office," he said. "For being exactly who you are." Grace looked at him for a moment, and then she did the thing she still did only occasionally, which made it more rather than less powerful. She smiled at him fully, the whole thing, illuminating her face with the quality of the person she was inside it, and she said, "You're welcome, and thank you for stepping into the land office when you didn't have to." "I had to," he said. "I didn't know it yet, but I had to." They walked back to where their horses were tied, in the October light, in the town that had been Frank's world for 25 years and was now Grace's as well, and they rode home together, to the Double H, which was home in the winter sense, where the house was warm and the fire was laid, and the children would come running when they heard the horses. And the land around them was the land they had both fought for and built on, and would leave to 2 children who were already, in their particular ways, learning what land means when you love it. Joseph Hadley, at 4 years old, would one day run a ranch of his own on this same ground. Eleanor Hadley, with her father's steady eyes and her mother's attention, would become a woman who surveyed her own land and kept her own records and knew her own mind with a clarity that was the direct inheritance of Grace Hart's example. But those were futures not yet arrived. What was present was the evening, the long-last light on the canyon walls, the smell of wood smoke from the ranch house chimney and the sound of the creek below the claim, making its music. Frank's hand and Grace's hand, their horses walking slowly through the cooling air, and between them everything that had been broken and unmade, and remade into something neither of them had expected. The old cattleman had convinced himself he was past feeling. He had been wrong, and it was the best mistake of his life, and Grace Hart, Grace Hadley now, was the reason he knew it. They reached the ranch as the last light left the sky, and the children were at the gate, Joseph with his mother's directness and Alina with her father's quiet, and the dogs were barking, and the lights were warm in the windows, and Frank Hadley dismounted and lifted his daughter and looked over her head at his wife, and Grace looked back at him with those clear gray eyes that had seen through him from the first moment and had not stopped seeing since. Some things you cannot rebuild once they're gone. Some things come back, and some things, the ones you find on the other side of the long, hard years, are more real and more solid for having been waited for, however unwillingly, however blindly, in the particular silence of a man who has decided he is past feeling and does not yet know how wrong that is. The night settled over Colfax County, New Mexico Territory, 1889. The stars came out over the high desert bright and cold and innumerable, the same stars that had hung over this ground since before any human being had put a name to it. The creek made its sound. The cattle were quiet in the south pasture. The sheep were settled on the creek-bottom grass of the Hart claim under the same stars. Frank Hadley sat on his porch with his wife beside him in the still night air, their shoulders touching, and he thought that the world was very large and very beautiful and that he had, against all his own expectations, found the person he wanted to see it with. He was not past feeling. He was not past anything. He had, in fact, only just begun.